1-6. That's the underwhelming record of the Milwaukee Bucks after their first 7 games of the season, as Coach Doc Rivers has been unable to get this team going. But how and why is a team so talented on paper struggling to even win just one regular season game? First of all, let's start with what this team doesn't do well, and then later I'll get to what this team is great at. The first negative for this Bucks team has been their defense. It's a well-known fact that this Bucks defense hasn't been good, but it isn't as simple as Doc not being a good coach or Milwaukee wishing they hadn't traded Drew Holiday. Instead, it has a lot to do with the new team defense the Bucks are trying to implement, which has led to some growing pains. New defensive coordinator Greg Buckner has a new defensive scheme that, when this team gets accustomed to, should provide a system that fits with the team's personnel. The system, from what we've been told, is to use their size. As with Lopez and Giannis in the front court, the Bucks want to force teams to take tough shots over these guys. What this means for the perimeter players is to run teams off the three-point line and funnel them into spots where they want them to be. However, that hasn't been the case to start the season, as the rotations out to the three-point shooters hasn't been good, which has then allowed open threes and mid-range opportunities, which has hurt this team. But that's not all for the defensive side of the ball, as they've had an issue that's perhaps even worse, and that's been their defense in transition. This was especially bad in the first few games of the season, as whenever teams could get out and run against this Bucks defense, they had an offensive rating of 190. In other words, teams were scoring 95% of the time whenever they could get out on a fast break against this Bucks defense, which is terrible. It's easy to look at these numbers and just say, well, Brook is old and slow, and that's gotta be the reason. But that isn't the main issue. The issue has to do with taking tough shots, as oftentimes it's Damian Lillard who'll take a tough shot on offense, leading to a long rebound, which then lets teams to start fast breaks. In the game against the Grizzlies, this was put on full display, as Lillard shot 1 of 12, allowing Ja Morant to have one of the craziest single game highlight reels I've ever seen. As here he hit Jaren Jackson on the move with a filthy dime, and then here he made an alley-oop sitting on the ground. The alley-oop is the Bucks' biggest weakness to guard, especially when it comes out of pick and rolls. What tends to happen is Brook is in his drop coverage watching the ball handler, and oftentimes bigs are able to just slip on behind him for open looks. This happens either because Brook can't recover, but oftentimes these guys are crashing from the corners, and it's the other Bucks players who aren't putting a body on these guys. This same issue of not boxing out then bleeds into their rebounding, which has been another issue for Milwaukee. On the defensive side of the ball, they're a solid rebounding team, ranking 7th best in the league. However, when it comes to the offensive side of the ball, their lack of rebounding greatly hurts this team, ranking 28th overall for offensive rebounding. Lots of these issues come back to lineup combinations, and once Chris Middleton comes back, that will help. But so far this season, any lineup with Giannis and Bobby Portis has been horrible, as so far the pair have a net rating of minus 24.3 points, which is horrendous. This number has a lot more to do with Portis than it does Giannis, as the fact of the matter is BP doesn't provide the same presence that Lopez does in the paint, and the numbers back that up as well, as the two-man combination between Brook and Giannis have a positive net rating of plus 1.2 points. So why does Bobby Portis all of a sudden look lost within this Bucks team? To understand that, we first need to look back at when he looked good within the team system. When Milwaukee was a defensive-minded team back under Coach Bud with Drew Holiday starting at point guard, the Bucks needed that offensive spark off the bench, and Portis filled that role perfectly. But now with Dame, Chris, and Giannis, Milwaukee no longer require his offense and are now asking him to do things that he isn't great at, like defending pick and rolls and being a rim protector. But to make matters worse, he hasn't even been good offensively this season, making just 25% of his threes, averaging just 11 points, down from his near 14 points per game on 40% shooting from deep he gave the team last season. But it isn't just Bobby Portis that can't buy a three, but it's also Gary Trent Jr., who's been struggling mightily, as he's also making just 25% from deep. These poor shooting numbers from Trent and Portis have led the Bucks to suffer on the offensive side of the ball also. These struggles come in the form of missed shots, stagnant offense, and overpassing. In the game against the Memphis Grizzlies, the team as a whole couldn't buy a bucket, making just 21% from deep, with Trent and Portis in particular making just 1 of 12 combined. With their perimeter guys not making shots, Dame and Giannis at times have fallen into the trap of playing isolation ball too much, as they're simply not able to trust their three-point shooters to make make open looks, and when they force up tough shots, it leads to transition opportunities for opponents. When teams are taking the ball out of the net constantly, they're not able to get out in transition, but when Milwaukee's offense is stuttering, they hurt themselves going the other way, as their poor offense bleeds into their defense. Another symptom of not making your open threes is overpassing, which is another issue that's hurt this Bucks team at times. Oftentimes, this Bucks team passes up multiple open looks, which either leads to a miss or a tougher shot. Overall, this isn't a bad sign, as guys are trying to make plays for each other, but sometimes you've got to be a little bit selfish, as this Bucks team needs to learn when to be selfish and when to be selfless. But now, let's get to what this Bucks team still has working in their favor, and why they could still be a title contender if they clean up their issues. First of all, the chemistry connections Damian Lillard has built over the offseason, especially with Giannis and Lopez, have been a highlight to start this season. In the game versus the Sixers, Dame and Brook were thriving, as the two-man game produced lots of open looks. Then in the first matchup against Cleveland, Dame and Giannis were making plays. The chemistry between Dame and Giannis in particular is something that we've been waiting to see, and they put it on full display in the game versus Cleveland, as the pair collectively put up 75 points and 18 assists, many of those to each other. Milwaukee were great in the first quarter, as they built a 16-point lead. However, their issues on defense and rebounding came back to bite them in the middle part of the game, where they allowed the Cavs to retake the lead before halftime. But in the second half, the Bucks would tighten up their defense and go blow for blow with Cleveland, taking a 1-point lead late in the game with just 9 seconds left, thanks to a tough mid-range hit from Dame. However, despite nearly forcing a backcourt violation and Donovan Mitchell losing the ball, he still managed to put in the dagger, as Milwaukee would lose the game by a single point, despite playing their best game of the season. Even though this team is sick of losing games and don't want to hear about moral victories, this was definitely a giant step in the right direction, and part of the Bucks' growth has been because of the lineup changes to boost their defense. Sophomore player Andre Jackson Jr. has provided a defensive spark off the bench and has real upside on that side of the ball, as at times he was put on Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland, and in the game he stood up, holding his opponents to just 39% shooting from within 20 to 24 feet from the basket, while also holding his opponents to just 42% from inside 9 to 5 feet, which are great numbers. The weaknesses in his game is playing defense without fouling and his overall offensive game. However, in the second game, he was able to make a couple of threes and stay out of foul trouble for his standards, as Jackson Jr. ended up having a real impact on both games. Another guy who's had an impact on this Milwaukee Bucks team outside of the main stars has been free agency signing Taurean Prince, who's making 54% from deep while playing above average defense on opposing wings. Then when you consider that he's going to be coming off the bench when Middleton returns, that's going to be a massive boost for this Bucks team, especially with their bench minutes and lineup rotations. Speaking of Chris Middleton, we all know how good he is when he's in form, as last season he led the NBA in mid-range shooting percentage for high-volume mid-range shooters, making 58% from inside the arc, which is better than SGA and Kevin Durant. For Middleton, he's also such a high IQ player, oftentimes acting as an on-court coach, as his playmaking and overall feel of the game is super underrated. But it's the bench rotations that will look much better when Middleton is available. As we mentioned earlier, the Bobby-Giannis connection has been a train wreck this season, but now with Middleton coming back, Doc Rivers is keen to test out a Giannis at the 5 lineup, which would feature Middleton at the 4, Prince at the 3, Gary Trent at the 2, and DeLon Wright at the 1. This lineup would give the Bucks the dominant two-man game of Giannis and Chris, while surrounding them with 3-and-D players. Also, because Giannis is at the 5, they would have a very mobile lineup, able to close out to any perimeter shooter with ease. Then if you added Dame into this lineup for DeLon Wright, this could almost act as a death lineup, similar to what the Warriors did in their championship years, playing Draymond at the 5. Then the other bench combination would look like Dame at the 1, Andre Jackson Jr. at the 2, Pat Connaughton at the 3, with Portis and Lopez at the 4 and 5. This gives you the dominant two-man game of Brook and Dame, with Ajax for defense and PC for three-point shooting, while Portis at the 4 could allow him to potentially take advantage of smaller players. The addition of Chris Middleton isn't going to improve their defensive issues, but in a way it will, as it's going to allow Milwaukee to run more dynamic lineups thanks to his IQ and position. For me, I'm not selling my Bucks stock just yet, as I still think this Bucks team on paper is capable of making some serious noise in the postseason. But that's just my take. Do you think this Bucks team can bounce back out of this slump, or is their season as good as over? Let me know in the comments below.